Hey, good evening, everyone. How are you? Yeah, let me tell you, what a great opportunity to be here this evening. I'm overjoyed that you all showed up during the rain. I think it's stopped for the most part now, but if you're from the area, you know what it's like driving around Northern Virginia in the rain, and there's crazies out there. It is my distinct honor to be here with you, fellow lovers of history, fellow veterans out there, and we have a couple of distinguished authors in here this evening as well, so thank you for joining us as well. Really a privilege and an honor to have you here. Thank you. So, you know, I heard that the bio doesn't really mean anything. When you ask a Marine what they've done in the Marine Corps, or really what you say is, oh, you're a veteran? What did you do? How do they respond? They don't say, I was infantry, I was artillery, I was tanks. They say, I'm a Marine. And not, I was a Marine, I am a Marine. Because once you earn that title, it stays with you for life. And so, why did I write this book? Because I'm a lover of our country, and the parallel stories that exist between the birth of our nation is the story of the birth of the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps. And also, because history and tradition is extremely important to Marines. It is a combat multiplier for us on the battlefield, because we refuse to let those Marines that went before us down. And we will go to great lengths to accomplish our mission and always succeed in what we do because of the history of our Corps. We owe it to our forefathers and our foresisters to be able to make sure we're living up to that legacy. So thank you for allowing me to be able to share some of that history with you today. So let's jump right in. I think you're all familiar with that photo, okay? And probably that quote from Ronald Reagan as well. And so many people are familiar with the honorable service and selfless sacrifice and the war-fighting prowess of United States Marines, but very few know about the actual Corps' humble beginnings and how, like our brothers and sisters in the Army, Navy, and actually state and militia groups, as well as privateers, contributed to the winning of our nation's independence and the preservation of our freedoms. So I think you know the story of the American Revolution, but really the roots of the American Revolution began well back during traced back to the French and Indian War between 1756 and 1763, in which England, France, and Spain were all vying for control of the North American continent. And although the British and Americans won that war, the victory and providing for the enduring defense of the American colonies cost quite a bit of money. In fact, the mother country thought it was only right that the colonials bear their fair share of the cost of their own defense, particularly since Americans were only paying about 1/20 of the taxes that those back in England were paying. But the independently minded Americans pushed back on those several imposed taxes, particularly when levied without proper representation in the government. And although neither country was seeking a war, conflict really was inevitable. And war came in April 1775 at Lexington and Concord. But that victory on land was really only half the equation, because America is a maritime nation. And with our countless lakes, rivers, canals, and an extensive eastern seaboard in which we're able to move people and move things much quicker than a very poor road network that existed back in the 18th century. So America would need men, and no offense, but back then it was only men, who could fight and win on land as well as the seas, if it hoped to defeat one of the most powerful nations in the world. And this became evident in mid-June of 1775 during an event that author James Fenimore Cooper called the Lexington of the Sea, in which an American patriot group captured 2 British merchant ships and a Royal Navy schooner named the Margaretta in the Battle of Machias, otherwise known as the Battle of Margaretta, that happened off of the coast of what would eventually become Maine, but was northern Massachusetts at the time. And that is what you see depicted in the Machias photo there, or painting there, which was actually the first naval engagement of the Revolutionary War. 4 days later, Colonel William Prescott led approximately 1,600 Americans up Breach Hill, not Bunker Hill, but Breach Hill, on the Charleston Peninsula, resulted in a British victory, but at a very high cost in the Battle of Bunker Hill. It was that same day that Washington was assigned command of the Continental Army, holding the British under siege at Boston. The immediacy of the crisis that occurred outside of Boston focused the Continental Congress their efforts on first establishing the Army out of necessity, but it would soon need to address the need for a Navy and Marines. Not possessing either at the time, Congress levied a temporary stopgap in the use of privateers, which in essence were sanctioned pirates. They were merchant vessels owned and operated by civilians that would get a letter of marque from the Congress to capture British ships, and then they would sell them for prize money. Excuse me. Privateers had some positive impact on capturing those British ships and their supplies, but many were in the business for personal gain. Their actions were rarely coordinated with the ground forces, and Washington had no control over them. In fact, they became a draw on the manpower and the resources needed by the Army, the Navy, and the Marine Corps as the war went on. So Washington quickly realized that the privateers alone were insufficient to blockade the British in Boston. Being resupplied and reinforced out of necessity, he created his own Navy using soldiers from the Continental Army to fill the role of sailors and Marines. And in fact, it was Colonel John Glover from Marblehead, Massachusetts, who was a fisherman by trade, who owned his own fishing fleet, who provided George Washington with his first ship named the Hannah, seen depicted here, named after John Glover's wife. Washington's Navy soon grew to 6 ships, all manned by soldiers, but although they had some early successes, the challenges associated with building a pickup team like that soon came to the forefront. And one of Washington's agents described the situation this way, and I quote, "The people on board the brigantine Washington are in general discontent, and they have agreed to do no duty on board said vessels, and they say that they enlisted to serve in the Army and not as Marines." Benedict Arnold also created a freshwater fleet and used soldiers out of necessity to man his ships and serve in the role of Marines. And that picture that you see painted there is a battle scene from the Battle of Belcourt Island up on Lake Champlain, 1775. Arnold also held the soldiers serving as Marines in contempt. And this is a quote from Benedict Arnold. Quote, "We have a wretched motley crew, the Marines, the refuse of every regiment, and the seamen, little of them ever wet with salt water." Okay, now think about that. If you're being tasked as an Army battalion with giving people up from your unit to go serve as sailors and Marines, are you giving your best people away? Or are you keeping your best fighters inside your own unit? Okay, so it's probably quite accurate what Arnold had to say about the low esteem that he held for the Continental Navy, and that has become moved on the 3rd of December. Congress asking to join the Union of North Americans fighting for their independence and freedom. Congress started salivating. They were like, this is our opportunity to create a 14th colony and bring Canada in the fight against the mother country. So Congress created a committee of 3 consisting of John Adams, John Langdon from New Hampshire, and Silas Deane from Connecticut. And they met in the 2nd-story room of this building you see in front of you, Tun Tavern. Okay? And at Tun Tavern, they created a plan to be able to conduct a naval amphibious campaign to Nova Scotia in order to capture Halifax, which was the principal British naval base in the North American continent. In order to do that, they needed Marines to conduct the landing operation to conduct that naval campaign with the fleet. Okay, and when we use the term naval, that means Navy and Marine Corps, as opposed to just Navy. Everybody tracking? Okay. In fact, we still use that same terminology today, even though okay, and I shared the fact that we have a proud serving female Marine here, and my youngest daughter, my baby daughter, actually just picked up Staff Sergeant and is serving honorably today. So. On November 9th, 1775, that committee of three briefed will be referred to as the 1st and 2nd Battalion of American Marines. Part of their today is our Commandant. So, following the note from Passamaquoddy, Congress assigned the Marine Committee to develop options for conducting that naval campaign in Nova Scotia. And they created the Marines in the plans that they developed there in Tun Tavern. Okay? Out and actively recruit their Marines. But the original plan for creating 2 battalions to conduct this operation up in Halifax was disestablished. In fact, what they decided to do is they were going to organize the Marines into 50-man companies, with 1 company of 50 Marines being assigned to a specific ship. And they would be the ship, or the Marine detachment, operating on board that ship. And what they could do is Marines had several roles and responsibilities. They were responsible for maintaining good order and discipline on the ship. They protected the captain against mutinous activity. They would fight from the fighting tops, the high points of the ship. These are the fighting tops here. They would shoot down at the enemy and snipe the enemy officers on the enemy ships that were fighting side by side against the American ships. They would also conduct limited operations ashore in order to achieve naval campaign objectives. For example, capture an enemy ship, parties onto other ships to capture them, or repel boarders trying to assume control of the American ships. Okay? So they would have these different roles and responsibilities, so they organized into these 50-man companies, and what they could do is they could do what we call task organize, where we combine several companies from different ships to create a larger unit to conduct limited operations ashore. In this case, that would be called a battalion. 2 or more companies create a battalion. That's going to matter here in a moment. Okay, so Nicholas led efforts to recruit these 5 companies to man the first 5 ships that the Continental Navy consisted of at the time. And a snapshot of one of those companies will give you a good profile of what a company of Marines looked like. And Isaac Craig commanded all but one of the Marines, 25 and a half years old, with the youngest only being 18 and the oldest being 40. Their average height was 5 foot 6 inches. The shortest Marine was only 5 foot 3. The tallest was 6 foot at the time. And they brought a litany of skills to their company: masons, barbers, bakers, cabinet makers, coopers, jewelers, brass founders, tailors, butchers, painters, weavers, woodcombers, millers, laborers, servants, and a single doctor, all in 40 people. So you could see that they were somewhat self-sufficient in being able to take care of themselves as well. So now we have a fleet, we have Marines, we're going to utilize them. The American sailors and Marines comprise about a quarter of George Washington's total force right before the historic events that happened in mid-December 1776. But one quick story about this guy, Andrew Porter. Andrew Porter would later resign his Marine commission to serve in the Continental Army Artillery. And I'll explain why here in a moment. Part of the reason is artillerymen get paid more money. Okay? Well, Porter becomes in the Continental Army, but he still has his Marine roots. And one of giving Porter a razz of crap. And he goes, Porter, you're nothing but a damn schoolmaster. And Porter pulls out his sword and he goes, I have not forgotten my vocation, sir, and hits him in the back of his buttocks, if you will, with the flat of his sword. Does anybody know what that represents? He was calling him out to a duel. So the two meet on the corner of Arch and 9th Street in downtown Philadelphia. They draw pistols and boom! Porter shoots Eustace right in the heart and drops him dead on the spot. They court-martial him for killing another officer. He is later exonerated. They promote him to major, and then they assign him the assignment that is now vacant because he killed the guy that was previously holding it. And that's a true story. You can't make that stuff up. Okay. So George Washington has now been able to build up his forces with the Continental Marines, with the militia forces, and he knows he has to seize the initiative. But before arriving at the Delaware River, he had sent word ahead to collect all the boats up from Philadelphia, 70 miles up the Delaware River, in order to prevent General Howe and the British from being able to cross over into Pennsylvania. So Howe puts his troops into winter quarters. And he does that by spreading them out in 17 separate and isolated cantonment sites across eastern New Jersey. The forces closest to the Americans are the Hessians, which are German mercenaries. There were 30,000 of them that came over to fight for the British as hired help. The Hessians in the area along, this is the Delaware River, with the Americans on the Pennsylvania side and the British and the Hessians on the New Jersey side. They were commanded by a gentleman named von Donop, who was a colonel who controlled the Hessians in the Bristol, Burlington area, with Philadelphia down here. And then there was a guy named Johann Rall, who commanded the Hessians in the Trenton area. Now, Washington knew that he needed to do this bold stroke in order to regain the initiative, but he knew he had to have three preconditions before he can do that. First, he had to consolidate his forces and build up his strength. He did that by getting the Associators, the Marines, and he called Continental Regulars under General Gates and Charles Lee up in New York to come down and join him to add to his numbers. So check one. Check two, he needed favorable conditions on the ground. He did that by wearing the Hessians down by sending raiding parties and intel patrols across the Delaware River to constantly harass the Hessians during the winter, keeping them always on the alert. The third thing he needed was the Hessians to make a mistake. And they did that one day when Philadelphia militia under General Putnam came across into this area here around Mount Holly, drawing von Donop down to engage with them. When he did that, that put von Donop 22 miles away from Trenton, which was a full day's march. Therefore, he could not provide raw support if he was attacked. Washington would have a full day in order to exploit that gap that was now created by von Donop moving to the south. So Washington creates a plan in which he's going to use one main element and three supporting elements to defeat the Hessians. He leads 2,400 soldiers personally to cross McConkey's Ferry 9 miles north of Trenton and then marches south to attack them from the north and from the west. There are about 1,200 Pennsylvania and New Jersey militia that were supposed to cross the river right south of Trenton and capture a key bridge across the Assunpink Creek on the south side of Trenton to prevent Rall and their Hessians from escaping as Washington attacked from the opposite direction. Cadwalader, the Associators, and Nicholas and the Continental Marines were supposed to cross in the Bristol, Burlington, Donop's forces in place so they could reinforce Rall. And then there was a fourth element as well. And everyone's trying to cross the river. The problem is that only one of the four elements successfully crossed the river that evening. And that was George Washington in the famous painting that you see here. actually got 2/3 of their force across the river before the storm became too severe. They were concerned for their safety. Men, we all consolidate, and right as he's getting ready to sign the letter, boom, 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 he starts hearing cannons going off up in Trenton. He didn't know Washington had made it over safely. And then he sees Hessians running across the New Jersey side of the river trying to escape from Washington. So as you can imagine, the Americans' blood is boiling now. The Marines are like, hey, to New Jersey in order to try and capture Donop's forces who are now in retreat. Unbeknownst to them, what happened? Washington wins the Battle of Trenton. He now has 900 Hessian prisoners, and he crosses back into Pennsylvania. So they're doing this. Cadwalader and the Marines are now in New Jersey. Washington is back in Pennsylvania. Cadwalader finds out, and now he starts to get squirrely again, and he's getting ready to abort the mission and cross back over into Pennsylvania a second time, and the Marines are like, oh, heck no. We're here, the enemy's there, they're trying to escape, let's run them down and capture them. So they take von Donop's forces under pursuit. As von Donop is trying to escape up into the Princeton area, where there is another brigade of British regulars holding out. They send they consolidate now 6,000 American troops all in one place. So for the first time, all of the Americans are able to consolidate their forces. Cadwalader are guarding the right flank in one of what we call a Fjorden site, which is a site in which they cannot drown. It's only chest deep there. So they have to guard it, otherwise the British could outflank the Americans and push them into the Delaware River. So they show up right around, British try to in Ossipin Creek, he always had an eye as to going further up north. He wanted to recapture all of eastern New Jersey. So as night falls and it becomes dark, Cornwallis pulls his forces out of Trenton and has them occupying his high ground that evening with the intent of crossing at this fording site, flanking the Americans, and destroying Washington and his force the following morning. And his officers are telling him, "Sir, we need to press the attack right now. We need to go now. If we don't go, Washington won't be there in the morning." And Cornwallis responds, "We'll bag the fox in the morning." Well, not so much, okay? Because in the evening, Washington uses guise and deception by stoking the campfires up along the lines, and he leaves 500 militiamen all along this line, making all kinds of racket like they're digging and they're preparing defensive positions. But what he really does flank. But what happens is So now Washington pounds of sterling in Brunswick, one town up from Princeton. And he knows that's where Charles Lee, the second in command of the Continental Army, who had been captured before the Battle of Trenton, is being held captive. He wants to go up and capture Brunswick now and get a fourth victory during what became known as the 10 Crucial Days. But his people are spent. They've been up for 40 hours straight. They've marched tens of miles in the middle of a blizzard. They crossed the river 3 times. They fought 3 major battles. They are done. They have hit what is called the culminating point. And the culminating point is that point that if you go beyond it, you can turn a victory into defeat. You will start to have diminishing returns. So he wisely listens to his officers, and what he does is, instead of going up to Brunswick, he takes a left and he goes up to Morristown. And then they start to winter in Morristown and rebuild the army. Because remember those terminating enlistments I talked about? They finally came to bear. They convinced many of the soldiers to stay for 6 more weeks, to give them 10 pounds of sterling to do so. Some did, but now everyone's starting to leave on Washington. The Philadelphia Associators, they all leave. Cadwalader, he's gone. Anybody know who this guy is? His name's up top. Henry Knox. Henry Knox is in charge of the Continental Artillery for the Army. The problem is, Knox now has more cannons than he has soldiers to man them. So he's looking around Morristown and he goes, wait a minute, don't you Marines know how to operate ships' cannons? Because that is one of the other duties that they do on a ship. In fact, Marine Corps detachments on board Navy ships continue to operate naval guns all the way until the 1990s, when, if you recall, we put the battleships back into service. If you go visit, for example, in Norfolk, the USS Wisconsin, that's a float museum now, you'll see one of the 5-inch mounts has an eagle, globe, and anchor, the Marine Corps symbol painted on it. That's because Marines exclusively manned that gun. Goes all the way back to the Continental times. So this picture depicts a naval gun. This is a field artillery piece. They look very similar, don't they? Except the Navy gun's a little bit shorter. They have a different carriage because of the way they had to be transported. They operate the same way. So Henry Knox goes to General Washington and says, General, can I have the battalion of Marines to become the Continental Artillery Corps for the Army? Granted. So for 4 months, the Continental Marines now become the artillery arm for the Army. The Marines don't mind. Remember what I said earlier? They get paid extra because they have technical skills that the regular infantryman does not. And in fact, Porter, who I said earlier, and Isaac Craig, 2 of the officers, wind up resigning their Marine commissions and staying for the rest of the war as Army artillery officers. But what happens eventually is that the Marines get their orders to go back to Philadelphia and man their ships once more, because those frigates are now nearing completion and the Congress wants to get them out on the seas to take the fight to the enemy on the seas. Okay? And that is the conclusion of this chapter of Washington's Marines and their contribution in the Revolution. Okay.